Hey folks, Malforian here, and today we're covering the latest Tinto Talks for Project Caesar, aka EU5. This is Tinto Talks 34, and in a topic that is definitely going to get this video demonetized, we're going to be talking about slavery today and how it works in the game. So buckle up, let's see what Johan has to say. So the first thing he's going to talk about here is slave population and how that works. So one of the 6 types of population we have are slaves. They've covered that in a previous dev diary. These lack pretty much every right in all countries and are simply there to be exploited. They are not allowed to move around on their own, and they have harsh enough lives that they are basically only keeping their current population levels at the best of times, and they have absolutely no income or any political power. If they get any sort of literacy, they are very likely to be rather upset because, again, they've covered this previously, where your literacy level actually affects how happy your population is, because the smarter they get, the more insight they have into things that are bad for them. So here, like if the slaves get literate, they then realize, well, you know, maybe I shouldn't be a slave. Very simply put, like, let's not get into that argument, but pretty much that's how it works in the game. They've talked about this previously with like cost of items for trading. If your population is literate, they will see like, oh, these guys over here are paying 1 gold for something and I'm paying 3 gold. I'm not happy about that now because I'm smart enough to kind of understand how trading works if you want to put it in really simple, basic ways. And again, this is kind of gamified. Obviously, slaves knew they shouldn't be slaves, but in-game it's shown even more so. If they get any kind of literacy, it kind of boosts that in some way. Again, just a game concept, not a real-world concept. At the start of the game, the usage of slaves is mostly gone from Europe, but is more prevalent in other areas of the world. And obviously that will change in the future. Well, not in Europe, but we know, you know, the trade triangle that occurred. So these are slaves in Cairo. Their population, there are 5,000 of these people in Cairo that are getting put to use by whoever is ruling that part of Egypt. And then the usage of slaves. So slaves are primarily used as resource gatherers, but they can be used in various buildings. These types of buildings can be categorized into 2 types. First, they have slave soldier buildings that require slaves to function and produce manpower or sailors. These include buildings like the Mamluk or the Janissary barracks and provide a part of the armies to the Mamluks and the Ottomans. So that is, you know, slaves in, soldiers out in one way, if you want to think about it. The second category of buildings, probably more well-known than that, are the plantations. These are buildings that unlock in the Age of Discovery. There are 3 types of plantations: sugar, tobacco, and cotton. They are far more productive than the RGOs for the same goods, but they require slaves to function, and obviously slaves will be outlawed later in the game, depending on the decisions made. And you can see this here, the galley barracks in Genoa. You can see how many slaves are employed, so it requires tools and slaves by the looks of it. This provides monthly sailors, can build ships here, yes. Current level, can get up to level 5. And the market access is 100%, which doesn't really affect it that much, I wouldn't think. Of course, outside of this, there is other reasons to have slaves. Some religions will require a steady stream of them to sacrifice daily to make the sun go up the next day. I think we all know which parts of the world that is, but they are going to be used for that as well, outside of just like buildings or actually just slave labor. So that is how slaves work. Well, how do you actually acquire them? There are multiple ways to do this. First of all, there is the classic way of conquering nearby territories and just enslaving their population. This is something that a diverse mix of cultures have done, and at the start of the game, Aztecs and the Kanem Empire could do this, as well as a bunch of other ones. They also get easy access to Casus Belli to go slave raiding in wars. As you sack a city, a percentage of that population will become slaves and appear in the closest slave market you have. And if none of those are near enough, they will appear in the closest slave market that isn't owned by you by the looks of it. The second way is through the Berber states, who engaged in slave raiding from the sea. They actually went really far with this. It's very interesting to read about the Berber states, different nations that went to war with them, which you wouldn't necessarily think did. In EU4, this was just a button that you pressed when you were near a coast and had no slave raiding cooldown active. In Project Caesar, this ability is now part of the privateering mechanic, in that if you have access to this ability, then your privateers will raid a random coastal location in the sea they are in and take some of the population of slaves for the nearest slave market. This is stopped by having a truce, over 100 opinion, or a good old coastal fortress. So again, as we've seen with a lot of these things, Johan and the team really trying to get away from press button does something. I know it's kind of the same here, but it is privateers will do this if they have the ability and they're in the right location and there's nothing preventing them from doing it. I know it's kind of semantics, I guess, but I like getting away from just press button, do something. It's more kind of like holistically built into it, if you want to think of it that way. And you can see here, coastal raiding, can hire privateers, yes. Can raid for slaves, yes. I guess unless you have something else blocking you from doing that. Thirdly, there is the slave market building, which will act as a hub for slave trades. It will also try and enslave population of non-accepted cultures and different religious groups as well. This is to simulate how the Delhi Sultanate and others enslaved populations in the conquered lands over time. So this is just like a gradual way to do it from lands that you have. And you can see an example here, a level 2 slave market. The requirements for it look quite high, actually, like the input you need, and then you get slaves out of it. You get the monthly enslavement level, current level it can be, and then the market access and how that is going to affect you. Like if you're playing as one of these nations, you know, we don't want to think about it too much, but you can kind of use this as a resource and then sell them off. And as you can see, it looks like it makes you quite a lot of money, which is pretty nice for you, not so much for the slaves. Fourthly, you have the ability to build slave centers in foreign locations that have less power projection than you. This is to simulate part of how Europeans got their slaves from West Africa to the New World, while a significant part of the slaves were bought from other African kingdoms that were willing to sell slaves taken from their enemies. They were also locally captured by the slavers themselves near the slaving centers. If you wish to fight this in your territories, you need to go to war and forcefully expel them. So really bringing in that like historical context and how it really worked historically into the game the best they can. But you can kind of try and get out of this if you get strong enough. You can force these people out and say, we're not interested in that anymore. Let's, you know, fight off the English, the Portuguese, whoever, and, you know, prevent this from happening in our lands. And then finally, as kind of hinted all the way through this, you can trade for slaves. In Project Caesar, slaves exist both as a type of good and a type of population, and they are slightly linked. Buildings can produce slave goods and require slave goods as an input. When a slave good is traded between market, the game also moves a population in relative size to the locations that have demand for slaves. So it is kind of like a weird dual kind of unit in the system as you're playing the game. Thus, if you have buildings or resource gathering operations that can use slaves, they will create a demand for slaves in the market. And if you trade from a market that both produces slave goods and has enough slaves present, the game will move about 200 population from the slave market each month for the good that you trade. So the kind of, you know, trade triangle. I can't remember the proper name for it historically, but we all know how that kind of worked between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. At the start of the game, there is the trans-Saharan trade, where North African countries imported slaves from West Africa, mainly sold by the Kanem Empire. Later on, during the Age of Discovery, you will see the triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and America, which will reduce the trans-Saharan trade volumes. So there we go, pretty much what I was just saying. There is, however, another market system, as the Mongol states will have access to taking slaves from conquered land, and with this they create the greatest slave trading network the world had ever seen. Since Muslim states could not keep Muslim slaves, and Christians did not want Christian slaves, the Mongols traded the Muslims to the Christians and the Christians to the Muslims. The trade links from India go to Central Asia as well, as Delhi trades their slaves to other markets, while they get the slaves they require for their Mamluk-style armies. So, as we're seeing here, trying to recreate a very complicated thing to discuss. As I said, this video will 100% get demonetized by YouTube, but I think they're doing a good way of setting this up and trying to recreate the historical examples of this that we know and that were, you know, well known to have happened. I'm sure there's some that we don't know that happened or just aren't big enough to recreate in the game, but they haven't really just recreated the triangle Europe, Africa, America one. They have gone for these trans-Saharan, the Mongols, the Delhi, all these other places where the same kind of thing happened, and really showing that it is, you know, a worldwide issue that happened. And then as the game progresses, I'm sure this will get covered in a future dev diary, how you can like outlaw this and force the end of it, as there were historical examples of that happening. But that is the dev diary for this week. Let me know what you think about it. Hit that like button if you enjoyed at least the discussion of the subject. The subject itself, obviously, not something to like, but it is part of the game. It is part of history. And this game is about recreating history. So it is something that has to come to the game just to give you that historical context behind things that happened and stuff like that. Next week, Johan says they're going to be talking about great powers and hegemonies. So that'll be interesting. That kind of level above like alliances and powerful nations. the great powers of the world and the hegemonies that they created. This is something that was in EU4, so it'll be interesting to see what has changed to Project Caesar, aka EU5. But we'll leave it there. As I said, hit that like button if you've enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new here. I'm covering all the dev diaries up to official announcement, launch, and beyond. And I cover Crusader Kings 3 in a very similar manner. So if you're interested in that game, do stick around. But I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.